It all started with a dream that quickly turned into a nightmare. Emily and Mark had always wanted a home of their own, a place where they could start a family, build a future, and leave the chaos of city life behind. When they stumbled upon the old Victorian house on the outskirts of town, it seemed too good to be true. The house was stunning, with its intricate woodwork, stained glass windows, and a sprawling garden that seemed frozen in time. The price was unbelievably low, and the real estate agent was eager to close the deal. "It's a historic property," the agent said, her smile a little too wide. "It's been vacant for a while, but it's got so much character. You'll love it." Emily did love it. From the moment she stepped inside, she felt a strange connection to the house, as if it were calling to her. Mark, ever the skeptic, joked about the place being haunted. "If we hear any ghostly moans, we'll just call the Ghostbusters," he said, laughing. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The first night in the house was uneventful. They unpacked their belongings, ordered pizza, and fell asleep exhausted but happy. But as the days went on, strange things began to happen. It started with the whispers. Emily was lying in bed one night, staring at the ceiling, when she heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, like someone murmuring just out of earshot. She sat up, her heart pounding, and listened. The house was silent. "Mark, did you hear that?" she asked, shaking him awake. "Hear what?" he mumbled, half asleep. "Sound like whispering." Mark groaned and rolled over. "It's probably just the wind. Go back to sleep." Emily tried to brush it off, but the whispers didn't stop. Night after night they grew louder, more distinct. She could make out words now. Her name, Mark's name, and phrases like, "Leave now," and "You don't belong here." Mark started hearing them too. At first, he tried to rationalize it. "Old houses make weird noises," he said. "It's just the pipes or the floorboards settling." But even he couldn't ignore the way the whispers seemed to come from the walls, as if the house itself were speaking to them. Then Mark started acting strange. He would stay up late, pacing the house and muttering to himself. Emily would find him standing in the living room, staring at the walls as if he were listening to something she couldn't hear. "Mark, what are you doing?" she asked one night, her voice trembling. He turned to her, his eyes glassy and distant. "Can't you hear them?" he whispered. "They're telling me things." Emily's blood ran cold. "Who's telling you things?" Mark didn't answer. He just turned back to the wall and continued muttering under his breath. The breaking point came one night when Emily woke up to find Mark standing in the corner of their bedroom, facing the wall. "Mark," she called, her voice shaking. He didn't respond. He just stood there, his body rigid, his head tilted as if he were listening to something. "Mark, what are you doing?" Still no answer. Emily climbed out of bed and approached him cautiously. As she got closer, she realized he was repeating the whispers word for word in a hollow, emotionless voice. "Leave now, you don't belong here, the house is awake." Emily grabbed his arm and shook him. "Mark, wake up." He turned to her slowly, his eyes blank and unseeing. "The house is awake," he said, his voice cold and distant. Terrified, Emily decided to investigate the house's history. She visited the local library and spoke to an elderly librarian who seemed reluctant to talk about the house. "The house, it's cursed," the librarian said, her voice trembling. "It was built in the late 1800s by a family who practiced dark rituals. Over the years, every family that's lived there has vanished without a trace. The last family disappeared 20 years ago. They left behind everything, clothes, furniture, even their car. It's like they just vanished into thin air." Emily's heart pounded as the librarian continued. "The house, it's alive. It feeds on the fear and souls of its inhabitants. The whispers you're hearing, those are the voices of the people trapped." Emily rushed home, determined to get Mark and leave, but when she arrived, the house had other plans. The doors and windows wouldn't open. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, and the walls seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. Emily found Mark in the basement, surrounded by strange symbols carved into the walls. He was chanting in a language she didn't understand, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "Mark, we have to leave," she screamed. He turned to her, his face twisted into a grotesque smile. "We can't leave," he said. "The house won't let us." Emily managed to break a window and escape, but as she ran, she heard Mark's voice calling her name. She looked back and saw him standing in the window, his face pale and lifeless, his eyes empty. "Emily," he whispered, "the house is awake." Emily moved away and tried to start a new life, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still watching her. One night she heard the whispers again, coming from the walls of her new home. The story ends with Emily standing in the corner of her room, staring at the wall, repeating the whispers as the camera pans out to reveal the house's shadow looming over her. Sarah had always dreamed of giving her son, Liam, a better life. After years of struggling to make ends meet in the city, she finally found a small, affordable house in a quiet, rural neighborhood. It wasn't much, just a modest two-bedroom home with a creaky wooden porch and a backyard overgrown with weeds. But it was theirs. The landlord, Mr. Grayson, was an elderly man with a stern demeanor. He handed Sarah the keys and gave her a tour of the house, but when they reached the basement door, he paused. "This door stays locked," he said, his voice firm. "Don't open it, ever." Sarah frowned. "Why? What's down there?" Mr. Grayson's expression darkened. "It's old and unstable, too dangerous to go poking around. Just leave it be." Sarah nodded, but as she watched him leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. The first night in the house was uneventful. Liam was excited to explore his new room, and Sarah was relieved to finally have a place to call their own. But as the days went on, strange things began to happen. It started with the noises. "Mom, do you hear that?" Liam asked one night, his voice trembling. Sarah paused, listening. The house was silent. "Hear what, sweetie?" "It sounds like footsteps and laughing." Sarah smiled and ruffled his hair. "It's probably just the house settling. Old houses make weird noises sometimes." But Liam wasn't convinced. He insisted that the sounds were coming from the basement. Sarah tried to ignore the noises, but they grew louder and more frequent. She started hearing them too, faint footsteps, muffled laughter, and the occasional sound of something scraping against the floor. One night she decided to investigate. She grabbed a flashlight and approached the basement door. The key was stiff, and the door creaked ominously as it opened, revealing a dark, damp staircase leading into the unknown. Sarah hesitated. Mr. Grayson's warning echoed in her mind. "Don't open it. Ever." But she needed to know what was down there. The basement was cold and damp, with a thick layer of dust covering the floor. Sarah's flashlight flickered as she scanned the room, revealing a series of strange symbols carved into the walls. The symbols were intricate and unsettling, forming patterns that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. As she stepped further into the room, her foot brushed against something on the floor. She shone the flashlight down and froze. There, in the concrete, was a single, child-sized handprint. Sarah's heart pounded as she knelt to examine it. The handprint was unnervingly fresh, as if someone had pressed their hand into the concrete while it was still wet. But that was impossible. The basement had been locked for years. As she stared at the handprint, she heard a faint giggle behind her. She spun around, but the basement was empty. After the basement incident, Liam started acting strangely. He became withdrawn and spent hours staring at the basement door. One night, Sarah woke up to find Liam standing at the foot of her bed, whispering, "He wants to play." "Liam?" she called, her voice shaking. He didn't respond. He just stood there, his eyes blank and unseeing. Sarah climbed out of bed and shook him gently. "Liam, wake up!" He blinked and looked at her, confused. "Mom? What are you doing?" "You were sleepwalking," she said, trying to sound calm. let's get you back to bed." But deep down, she knew something was wrong. Desperate for answers, Sarah visited the local library and talked to an elderly librarian who knew the house's dark past. "The house. It's cursed," the librarian said, her voice trembling. "It was built by a man who practiced dark rituals. He disappeared decades ago, but the things he summoned never left." Sarah's blood ran cold. What kind of things? The librarian leaned in closer, her eyes wide with fear. "They say he summoned a shadow, a malevolent entity that feeds on fear. It's particularly drawn to children." Sarah's heart pounded as the librarian continued. "The symbols in the basement. They're a summoning circle. Once the entity is called, it can't be sent back. It's bound to the house, and it won't stop until it claims its next victim." Sarah rushed home, determined to get Liam and leave. But when she arrived, the house had other plans. The basement door was wide open, and Liam was nowhere to be found. "Ian!" Sarah screamed, her voice echoing through the empty house. She grabbed a flashlight and descended the basement stairs, her heart pounding with every step. The symbols on the walls glowed faintly, and the air grew colder as she reached the bottom. There, in the center of the room, stood Liam. His eyes were blank, and he was chanting in a language Sarah didn't understand. Behind him, the shadowy figure materialized, its form shifting and twisting like smoke. "Liam!" Sarah cried, rushing toward him. The entity turned to her, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "He's mine now," it said, its voice guttural and inhuman. "Shh." Sarah fought to free Liam, but the entity was too powerful. In a desperate attempt to save him, she offered herself in his place. The entity accepted, dragging her into the darkness as Liam collapsed to the floor. Liam woke up in his bed with no memory of what happened. He called for his mom, but the house was eerily silent. As he walked downstairs, he saw the basement door wide open. "Mom?" he called, his voice trembling. There was no answer. Liam approached the basement stairs and peered into the darkness. A faint whisper echoed from below. "Come play." The story ends with Liam standing at the top of the stairs, staring into the darkness as the shadowy figure reaches out to him. Maya had always been a diligent student, but her final year of college was proving to be more stressful than she'd anticipated. With exams looming and a thesis to write, she needed a quiet place to focus, somewhere far away from the noise and distractions of campus life. The search for an affordable and serene space led her to an old, secluded property nestled deep in the woods, far from the nearest town. The rent was unbelievably cheap, and the landlord, Mr. Hargrove, seemed oddly eager to hand it over. "It's a bit quirky," he said, his expression unreadable as he handed her the keys. "But it's quiet, perfect for studying." Maya didn't ask what he meant by quirky. She was too relieved to have found a place within her budget. The prospect of solitude and undisturbed hours of work outweighed any vague warnings. With her books, laptop, and a small suitcase in tow, she moved in, ready to immerse herself in her studies. The house was smaller than she'd expected, with creaky wooden floors and walls that leaned inward, as though the structure were stooping under the weight of years. Despite its weathered appearance, it had a certain charm. A cozy kitchen, a snug bedroom, and large windows that framed the surrounding woods. It felt like the perfect retreat from the chaos of her academic life. That first night, as Maya lay in bed, exhaustion from the move finally overtaking her, she heard it, a faint rhythmic creaking. At first she dismissed it as the groans of an old house settling into the cool night air. But as she lay there, the sound grew more pronounced, more deliberate. It was almost as if the house itself were breathing. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. The sound was coming from the walls, a slow, steady groan that rose and fell like the inhale and exhale of some massive creature. "It's just the wind," she whispered to herself, pulling the blanket tighter around her. "Or the house settling. Old houses do that." But deep down she wasn't convinced. Over the next few days, Maya tried to focus on her studies, but the house refused to let her. The breathing grew louder, and the walls seemed to shift subtly, almost imperceptibly, as though they were expanding and contracting in time with the sound. The floors creaked under her feet in ways that felt intentional, as if guiding her movements. Despite her best efforts to rationalize the phenomenon, an uneasy feeling began to settle in her chest. One night she woke up to find her bedroom door wide open. She was certain she'd locked it before going to bed. Adrenaline coursed through her veins as she climbed out of bed, her foot landing in something wet. She looked down and gasped. There, on the floor, was a trail of muddy footprints leading from the door to her bed. Terrified, Maya searched the house from top to bottom, but there was no sign of an intruder. The doors and windows were all locked from the inside, and the mud on the floor was the only evidence that anything had happened. Desperate to feel safe, she decided to install security cameras. If someone, or something, was breaking into the house, she needed to know. The cameras captured nothing unusual at first. Days passed, and Maya began to think she'd overreacted. But then one night, she woke to the sound of her bedroom door creaking open again. Heart pounding, she grabbed her laptop and pulled up the camera feed. What she saw made her blood run cold. The house was moving. The walls shifted, the floors rippled, and the layout of the house changed before her eyes. It was as if the house were alive, rearranging itself to trap her inside. Maya watched in horror as the corridors twisted and stretched, leading nowhere. The house seemed to pulse with a strange, unnatural energy, its breathing now a deep, resonant hum that filled every corner. Determined to understand what was happening, Maya began researching the house's history. She visited the local library, where an elderly librarian listened intently as she described her experiences. The woman's face paled as she spoke. "El house, it's cursed," the librarian said, her voice trembling. "It was built by a man named Elias Hargrove, an architect who dabbled in unnatural practices. He vanished decades ago, but the house he created never stopped." Maya's heart raced as the librarian continued. "They say Hargrove used forbidden techniques to design a living house, but something went horribly wrong. The house became sentient, feeding on the fear and energy of those who lived there. It traps people, keeping them inside for as long as it can." Panic gripped Maya as she drove back to the house. She was determined to leave before it was too late. But when she arrived, the house had other plans. The doors and windows refused to open. The walls shifted, blocking escape routes and guiding her deeper into its labyrinth. The house seemed alive, its breathing a steady rhythm that grew louder with each passing moment. Maya found herself in a room she'd never seen before. Its walls were covered in strange symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. The air was thick, heavy with an oppressive energy that pressed down on her chest. In the center of the room stood a figure, a man with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. "Welcome home," he said, his voice echoing through the room. Maya's breath caught in her throat. It was Elias Hargrove. But he wasn't alive. His translucent form shimmered like smoke, and his gaze pierced through her. "You can't leave," he said. "The house needs you." Desperate, Maya tried to run, but the house overwhelmed her. The walls closed in, the floors buckled, and she was dragged deeper into its shifting depths. She screamed, clawing at the walls, but it was no use. The house consumed her, its breathing now a triumphant roar. When Maya woke, she was back in her bedroom, or at least a room that looked like her bedroom. The windows were bricked up, and the door led to another endless hallway. The house had transformed, reshaping itself into an inescapable prison. The air was thick with the sound of its breathing, a constant reminder of her fate. Outside, a new "For Rent" sign appeared in the yard, swaying gently in the breeze. The house waited patiently, its hunger never sated, ready for its next victim to step through the door.